Hello, and welcome to the Clinical Care Options Infectious Disease podcast. Today's episode is the third of a four-part series entitled An HIV Vaccine, An Unfulfilled Promise, which is produced in collaboration with the Global HIV Vaccine Enterprise at IAS, the International AIDS Society. This series features conversations between world-renowned guests in HIV vaccine development, HIV advocacy, and HIV policy to bust myths and address arguments for why an HIV vaccine is still needed and how we can continue working toward this ultimate game changer for durable control of the HIV epidemic. This episode features a discussion between Dr. Swati Gupta and Dr. Marc Dixneuf. Swati Gupta is the Vice President and Head of Emerging Infectious Diseases and Scientific Strategy at the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. Mr. Marc Dixneuf is the Director General of AIDS, a nonprofit HIV/AIDS advocacy organization in France. Their conversation focuses on how to broaden global advocacy and increase investment for an HIV vaccine. We will also hear insights from Professor Jonathan Weber, the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at Imperial College London. For more information about Dr. Gupta, Mr. Dixneuf, and Professor Weber, and for links to additional podcasts in this series, as well as HIV Unmuted, the IAS podcast series reflecting on the last 40 years of HIV research and advocacy, please visit the links in the show notes. Dr. Gupta and Mr. Dixneuf, thank you for joining me today for a conversation about where we go from here with HIV vaccine development. So the first topic that we want to touch on is just a reminder to our audience that HIV/AIDS is still a global health crisis. Can you please share your thoughts on AIDS fatigue and why people are tending to forget that HIV/AIDS is still an issue?
The very first thing is that we are used to repeat always the same things during the last 30 years. So we are tired of what we are saying about prevention and reduction risk strategies. And I think that the same for some political leaders who were used to support us many years ago, and they want to change to be mobilized on other topics which seems more important, like climate change and so on. And I think so that what generates AIDS fatigue is that we have treatments, and in rich countries we have PrEP and we have TASP and we have lots of great things, but we still fight against stigma and discrimination. And it's an endless fight. And we are more dedicated to fight against stigma and discrimination, and we sometimes forget that we need a vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree wholeheartedly with all of Marc's comments. And, I would add that certain marginalized communities, particularly those in low and middle income countries, I think we all know really bear a disproportionate burden of the HIV infections globally, when you compare to the general population. And I do think that that's one of the reasons that you have this fatigue, or maybe a different term might be, sort of HIV and AIDS disregard, and why that exists. When you have people that are most at risk and they're less visible, I do think it allows people to not really keep the issue front and center. And, we've also seen that in general, when you have an outbreak, for example, and that outbreak subsides, then you see that the commitment to vaccine development also subsides. And we've seen this with things over the years like Ebola, but I think HIV and AIDS is at risk for a similar fate. And that's really due to this false narrative, that HIV is a manageable disease. I have many people sort of ask me that, isn't that the case? Because so many people in high income countries have access to daily treatment or preventative medication. Not only is lifelong daily medication not sustainable financially for the long term, but a third of people living with HIV still aren't accessing it. So a globally accessible vaccine would really help with both of those problems. And then lastly, I think that I would just mention that, because of this fatigue, we're seeing that, many governments are deprioritizing the response to HIV and AIDS. And of course, that radically slows down our progress. and our goal to, try to end HIV and AIDS. And with COVID-19, there is a risk that we might reverse some of the important gains that we've made. We know some countries have decided to really reduce their funding to groups like UNAIDS. And, I think that those types of decisions will really affect programs in lower and middle income countries. So I think we have to look for ways to combat the fatigue.
We have to think stronger and about what are the needs in low and middle income countries. That solutions which works in our countries are not necessarily the solutions for low and middle income countries. Because in our countries, we are very concentrated epidemics, but it's different. So I think that the implementation of vaccine and vaccine strategy can help to remobilize decision makers. It's a very good point to reaffirm that research for vaccines can help much more beyond HIV. And we have to tell that story, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. And I think that is to be positive and productive. I think one way to combat the fatigue is to highlight, all the different ways that decades of research in HIV over 3 decades, in particular for the vaccines, have really contributed to the rapid development of countermeasures for COVID-19. And, we wouldn't have been able to respond as quickly to the pandemic without all of the virological and immunological advances in HIV research. We should shine a light on them in terms of the important work we've done on HIV that then led to us to advance more rapidly, for other disease areas like COVID-19. So 100% in agreement.
Thank you both for your thoughts on that. As a note to our listeners, Podcast 2 of this series is an in-depth discussion of what we have learned and built through the last 40 years of HIV vaccine research, and how the advances in scientific knowledge and infrastructure from HIV vaccine research were crucial to the rapid and successful development of the COVID-19 vaccines. So I encourage you to check out that episode to hear more on that topic. The first episode of this series touched on some of the prevention tools we have already and where a vaccine would fit. Can you give us a little reality check on the gaps in our current prevention toolbox?
Sure. I always think it's important to underscore the tremendous progress, so I think it is fantastic that we do have so many tools in the toolbox, and you did cover those nicely in the last podcast. But I also would agree, that many of the tools in our toolbox are not readily accessible or acceptable for some people. And at IAVI, access has been really core to our mission since we were founded 25 years ago as a product development partnership, or a PDP, focused on HIV R&D. And, I think all of us would agree that vaccines have, very far-reaching health, social, and economic benefits when they're broadly available and accessible. And we know from a lot of our work over the last few decades, within communities that are disproportionately affected by HIV, for example, women and adolescent girls, that there are different social challenges in them utilizing some of these tools, like PrEP, where you take a daily pill. And there are studies where they looked at, lack of adherence to PrEP, as one example, and highlighted some of these social factors, like the stigma of taking a pill, or just in general, the low decision-making power that these women and girls have, and sort of the barriers that those cause to widespread PrEP uptake, and in some cases exposing those women and girls to greater risk. So I think that a vaccine really could overcome some of these barriers if it was deployed equitably, in addition to these other tools that we're trying to use.
I think that the question of inequalities between people is very important, because we have to start from the needs of people and the desirability of each prevention strategies. And it's very important. And we must not consider that what is expected for one communities would fit to all communities. and the question of gender, for example, the question of young women in certain countries. It's very important to consider that long-acting or PrEP, it's not a magic response for everybody. And that's one point. The other point is that at the beginning of PrEP in France, there was strong discussion about what is about to take a PrEP during the whole life to stay negative. And it's completely different to consider a vaccine because there is some side effect with treatment. So we must support all treatment strategies like PrEP and TASP, but we must also support a strategy, a prevention strategy, which not implies to take a treatment for life. And I think it's very important. It's not easy to implement strategies to promote PrEP for MSM in Mauritania or in Senegal or in such countries. It would be more easy to promote vaccine strategies. And it's very important. We, as a community-based organization, AID in France, we consider that one of the first aim is to change society, but sometimes it's easier in some countries. And I think that vaccine should be considered as a good strategy for some countries where life is very, very hard for some key population.
I would, of course, once again agree with that. So we certainly wholeheartedly all agree we need a vaccine to help end the pandemic. But I think until then, there's a lot of other things we can be doing. One is to reduce the stigma, which was already mentioned, around HIV and AIDS. And hopefully that will result in higher acceptance of a vaccine when we do have one. And we need to work with communities to increase vaccine confidence and help dispel some of the myths, that we see out there, and really try to get correct information to people about how vaccines are developed and tested and deployed in a way that's, simple and digestible. It's not always easy to talk about these topics, and especially, if you look at what's been going on with COVID, it's a complex topic.
I agree about the question of dispel myths. Well, in France, we take the English term debunk. We have to debunk the question about vaccines, and we have to work on that. And we have to think too that we have to work strongly about stigma and discrimination, as has been said, because what we noticed in France with COVID is that you have sort of replication of discrimination in health. So if we have a vaccine, we have to promote vaccine with the support of sex workers communities, MSM communities, not only community-based organization of people living with HIV as AID is, but AID is not only an organization about HIV people living with HIV. It's very important to work with those communities to debunk all things around vaccine, help them to appropriate this strategy, which seems very far today. A vaccine for HIV is very far. Research, it's very present in HIV, but it seems for communities very far. So we have to explain that it's not so far, that we have to be ready to implement vaccine. And it's very important, this question of debunk, of dispel myths.
So now I want to talk about strategies to move HIV vaccine research and development forward. And to start this discussion off, let's hear a clip of Dr. Galit Alter discussing what she perceives as some inefficiencies in R&D development that she shared during a satellite session at the 2021 HIV Research for Prevention Conference in January.
Yeah, so maybe I can say something a little controversial, but I think that the difference between COVID and HIV, from my perspective, is that HIV's vaccine development has been incredibly siloed. There's no question that over the last 30 years, there has been groups that have formed that are pushing really critical and really transformative agenda forward. But rarely are those silos communicating with one another. Now, the last thing we want to do is to reduce competition, because competition creates innovation and creates, really leverages creativity. But I think that the one thing that has changed, which I think, is really critical, is this cross communication across those silos. And so, although I think we don't want to advocate more Zoom meetings, I think we all have enough two-dimensional conversations, but I think it's breaking down the silos is really what's going to take us into the next phase, is thinking through how do we begin to create those conversations that reduce inefficiencies in development. Why should everyone be developing antibodies to the same site? Why should everybody developing antibodies that have the same modifications? Do we need to have vaccines that induce the same flavors of immunity? That is not an efficient use of our brains and our time. And so thinking about ways that we can create efficiencies in the system, again, trying to self-organize within a community of incredibly effective science, that may be the way that we reinvigorate the field and start to maximize on efficiency to develop the next products.
I spoke separately with Professor Jonathan Weber, who has been a researcher in the HIV field since 1982, for his take in Dr. Alter's suggestion that there needs to be a more collaborative effort among HIV researchers. In general, he disagreed with her take. Here is what Dr. Weber had to say when I asked him.
So I don't agree with the statement, actually. So the one area where there's been more attempts than anything else in science I'm aware of to coordinate has been HIV vaccine work. And actually the relatively small number of people who are now putting their heart and soul into HIV vaccine work is relatively small in global terms. And they're all aware of each other's work. I think it's not coordination it needs, it's evidence of efficacy. And this is where we're just still in a dreadful position of never having had a compelling clinical trial showing protective immunity. And while we live in hope for the ongoing studies at the moment, it is hope rather than expectation that they'll be successful.
I also asked Professor Weber to reflect on what was done differently in COVID-19 vaccine research and how we can move forward with an HIV vaccine at a similarly accelerated pace.
So when COVID struck, there was a willingness to fast-track vaccine development at risk, if you like, with essentially unlimited funds. And certainly in the UK, which I can speak of very closely, there was a very coordinated approach to expanding clinical trials from phase 1 up to phase 3 extremely rapidly, and in tandem creating manufacturing capacity to make sure that you had not just the material for the phase 3 and subsequent studies, but you'd be able to roll out fast should you have a successful result.
Dr. Gupta had a similar take to that of Dr. Weber regarding the pace of vaccine development and acceleration of moving candidates into and through clinical trials. Here's what she had to say.
Well, I think that there's many things that we could think about in terms of how we approach vaccine R&D that follow on nicely from some of those comments. And, from a scientific perspective, one of the things we've thought a lot about with HIV vaccine development is how do we get different products or immunogens to clinical trials more rapidly. The science is evolving so quickly that sometimes by the time we get a candidate to the clinic, we already know that there's better candidates preclinically. So one of the things that we can think about is using mRNA technology for the development of HIV vaccines, and we're doing that, and others are doing that, because it allows you to produce material for clinical trials much more rapidly, than other approaches like recombinant proteins, for example. And also, it allows you and it enables us to do sort of what we call more rapid and iterative clinical testing. So we can test multiple candidates and then get a better feel for which ones might be promising, or do we need to go back to the bench? So, that type of technology allows us to cut a lot of time out of the process and be more nimble in terms of advancing different candidates. And especially if you're talking about regimens that might involve several doses of vaccine where you're trying to build on the immune response from one to the next. So I definitely say there's a lot of science that I think has changed how we're approaching R&D. The other area that I wanted to mention is partnership models. And we use the word partnership pretty loosely, but innovative public-private partnerships, there's a real skill, and we kind of talk about the science of partnerships. And we certainly saw that to advance COVID-19 vaccines very rapidly. And I think the same kinds of partnerships, could be utilized for HIV vaccine development. Obviously where you have the financial and the scientific commitment, but making sure that you're taking different disciplines and bringing them together in a way that you're able to move the needle on a scientific challenge in a way that you haven't been able to before. And, we've been doing some of that, where you think about, how do you get the device companies to talk to the, manufacturing people so we can really make sure, that we're sort of developing candidates that are, for example, thermostable, but also, work in terms of the platform that we have. So, having people from different disciplines come together, I think you see a lot of light bulbs go off, and especially when you have partners that are driven by a common goal or mission.
I agree with this point. It's very important, on especially about the question of disciplines. I think that we have to think about the needs of the communities. And the communities who need HIV vaccine need other vaccines, which are not always developed, or we have low research on it about syphilis or gonorrhea, which are sexually transmitted diseases, which are very frequent for people living with HIV or exposed to HIV. Maybe a way to reinforce the importance of vaccine R&D for communities, it's to ask them what are their needs and to create some communities of communities about people exposed to HIV, and the community with researchers who are engaged in research in HIV or in other STIs. And the other point, and I insist on that, it's to be engaged very early in research. In France, we are not maybe the best place to make HIV vaccine research, but very often we are asked to contribute to a promotion of a research, but very late in the development. So communities have to be involved very early in research, as we have been for treatment. And I think it's very important.
So moving on from vaccine R&D to our next topic, which is policy and funding. This podcast series has been referring to an HIV vaccine as the ultimate game changer. How do we convey this to policymakers, politicians, and funders? Dr. Weber shared his thoughts on this and noted that the onus is on scientists to show an effective vaccine is possible.
I feel still the fundamental problem with an HIV vaccine is one of scientific credibility. I think governments all over the world understand the financial and healthcare burden of HIV in their populations and the challenge to meet and reduce that. And the sheer cost of PEPFAR and a global fund in less well-resourced areas shows just what a burden this HIV/AIDS still is globally. So the issue of a vaccine is that the scientific community have yet to produce convincing data to suggest a vaccine is possible. And this is, for me, the key rate-limiting step in going to government for more money.
I think that, as Swati said previously, that no infectious disease have been, no fight against an infectious disease, a success without a vaccine. So we have to tell the story of other diseases like measles or others for poliomyelitis, that we need a vaccine for each infectious disease. It's as if HIV is a different infectious disease because we build a specific way to fight HIV, because we built the question of human rights as the basis to fight HIV. But it remains an infectious disease, and for each infectious disease, we need a vaccine. Despite the fact that we have success without a vaccine, we still need a vaccine if we want to reach the end of this epidemic.
I would completely agree. I mean, I think we just need to find ways to retell the story. And remind people, that we still have this unrelenting rate of new infections each year, 1.7 million people newly infected. We've seen decreases in that incidence, of HIV in that figure. But if you think about it, not really. You're still talking about close to 2 million new infections. And I think sometimes people, hear the numbers, but they don't really process them. That's sort of staggering for where we are and how many decades we've been, with HIV. And, then in 2019, there were 38 million people living with HIV. And we know that about a third of those people with HIV don't have access to treatment, which means that, they could be transmitting the virus to others, which feeds into that 1.7 million new infections each year. So I think we have to keep telling the story of how we're doing. I think we can also leverage the COVID-19 example and apply that to HIV and TB and other diseases. I think the pandemic really underscored the urgency of ensuring equitable access to these new technologies. And we see that we still have a long way to go. And, through the pandemic experience, we also saw novel strategies and new ways of collaboration to accelerate the development and deployment of the different innovations, whether that was incredible financial investment or doing activities in parallel or, trying to apply new technologies. So I think we should take the lessons of COVID-19 and use it to help raise the profile for other infectious diseases like HIV and TB and say, look at what we did for COVID. Now let's do it for other diseases.
When I spoke with Professor Weber, he agreed that now is the time to push policymakers to prioritize funding for the development of an HIV vaccine.
I think there's never been a better time than 2021 to get vaccines onto the political agenda, at a really enhanced level, and that's because of COVID. I think that the dramatic response of the academic world and industry, both together and independently, to addressing a COVID vaccine, SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, and its rapid rollout has convinced politicians that vaccine technology is there, it's tractable, it's economically viable, the returns are very high, and I can't imagine a better time to be reintroducing the concept of an HIV vaccine as a priority for global public health.
I would agree. It's public perception, as we've been discussing, does play a role in, why people may not be advocating as strongly, for a vaccine with something like COVID-19, a global pandemic where people were affected in every corner of the world. And, you saw substantial public and political will and industry investment, as we should have seen. It was easier in some ways to move forward at a pace that, I think was unprecedented in development of a vaccine. But if you compare that with HIV, which for some is seen as a, disease of poverty that maybe only affects certain geographies, like the global South, and some people believe it's controllable with daily medication. I think that's the issue we have, and we have to keep reiterating the 1.7 million new infections, as of 2019. But yet investment has been sort of relatively flat for the last 10 years. And, marginalized communities, again, in low and middle income countries, really bear the disproportionate burden of HIV globally. And I think that plays into why maybe you're not sort of hearing voices as much as you should. Again, we need to find a way to advocate for the people where the greatest burden is, and to advocate that we continue the work on a vaccine. And in some ways, the HIV and AIDS response, treatment was such a success story. We have effective treatment. But again, it's aided the incorrect perception that HIV is under control. I think the investment is vastly different, between something like COVID versus HIV versus TB. And, I know there's some data where, the number for HIV prevention R&D globally was, around $1 billion. And if you compare that, to to COVID, we know there's been tens of billions of dollars that's gone into the vaccine R&D. In the US alone, I've heard figures around 20 billion. So I think we need to figure out how do we keep the contributions steady and then also increase them. So we don't want them to decrease, but then how can we increase these investments? And again, focusing on the tremendous advances in vaccinology and infrastructure through the development of HIV vaccines, I think can help to make that case.
About investment, I agree what has been said. And I think that it's very important to reaffirm that investment for HIV research is an investment for everybody and not only for people who are concerned by HIV. It's an investment for marginalized and excluded people, and that's something which is the fight against AIDS has always been political because it concerns people which are socially discriminated. And I think that's what is very difficult for research about AIDS vaccine, that it's a vaccine for people who are discriminated and that society does not want to help MSM, sex workers, drug users, and so on. But we have to support those investments because it's for a global investment for the whole society.
Finally, Dr. Gupta and Mr. Dixneuf, can you share actionable steps that should be taken to keep moving toward the development of an effective and equitable HIV vaccine?
I think that for me, the point is a question of communities, the involvement of communities, and the fight against stigma and discrimination. Because if tomorrow we have a vaccine, I'm afraid that if we have a vaccine, the one who first have access to vaccine would not be the people who deserve it first. And it's very important. So we have to involve communities very early first, and we have to continue the fight against stigma and discrimination, because when we have the vaccine, we have to be sure that the first people who have access to vaccine are the people who need it more than the others. And I think young women, discriminated people, migrants, for example, drug users, or MSM.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's extremely important, just a very important point. For a couple I would advocate for in terms of actionable steps, just coming from a product development perspective, I would say start planning now for broad access to HIV vaccines and, build in those accessibility and affordability attributes, into how the product is designed. And then last, I'd say we should support capacity strengthening for vaccine R&D in the high burden countries so that a very full research agenda can be actualized across geographies where the HIV vaccine will be needed the most. So really making sure that we, in a meaningful way, support that capacity strengthening so that we're able to not only test, but then implement those innovations in the communities that need them.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, Mr. Dixneuf, and Professor Weber for sharing your insights on how we can increase advocacy for an effective and accessible HIV vaccine. And thanks to our listeners for joining us. As a reminder, click on the links in the show notes to listen to the HIV Unmuted podcast series produced by IAS and to join us for the last podcast in this series, which will focus on promising advances in the field of HIV vaccine research and how we can prepare for optimal rollout of an eventual HIV vaccine.